Morning's sermon, I've basically struggled to find a good title for, and basically all it really is a warning. Danger lurks about. Title for my sermon. There's danger prowling around. But this morning I'm giving you a warning. And basically I want to tell the story or deal with the story of Judas Iscariot. Now, Judas Iscariot is a man that made his mark on history. I mean, wherever you go, I don't know whether anybody nowadays calls their child Judas. That just would be incomprehensible. Yeah, but he really made his mark on history. The Oxford English Dictionary says a Judas is a person who betrays a friend. Now, the Gospel of John, this passage here that we're dealing with this morning, and other passages that we will look at, portrays and draws a devastating picture of Judas. It's probably one of the most devastating pictures in the whole of the Bible of another human being. The situation that we read about, that we find Jesus and his disciples in the upper room that evening, and when he deals with this, confronts Judas with his betrayal, it's a very painful situation. As we read in this passage, when we read it in verse 20, Jesus says to the people, it grieves his heart. And he spoke about his distress that he experienced. And in these words, as we've seen earlier in John as well, we see the depth of trouble Jesus suffered for our sakes. His trouble during his earthly life, his earthly ministry are far beyond what we as humans can fully grasp and understand. Yeah, so many things happen. Bad things happen to him. So many people attacking him and vilifying him and challenging him. And here we see Jesus coming to the final stage of his sorrow. He's gone through so much, and we've looked at a lot of that, a lot of the conflict he had, the attempts of his life, the attempts to arrest him. And here he comes on this night. He's coming to this final stage of his sorrows. And attention is brought to the depth of Christ's suffering. It is a treacherous and humiliating, in a treacherous and humiliating manner, the Lord of glory is being handed over to his enemies by a close friend. This is a story about his suffering. And we must never make the story about Judas, although we will talk a lot about Judas today. We always remember it's not about Judas. It's not about Annas, the high priest. It's not about Pilate. It's about Jesus and the suffering that he had to go through and the humiliation that he had to go through for you and for me. So Isaiah chapter 53 verse 3 tells us he was a man of sorrows and he suffered much. Now, besides all his enemies that he had and the sorrow of now on this night, seeing a disciple that he had chosen, that was part of the 12 that traveled with him, somebody that had seen the miracles he did, heard the teachings. This one, a chosen apostle, backslide and betray him. Pain of it. Pain of betrayal, backsliding, and breaking of trust. That's what's at issue here this morning. Sure, as I use those words, betrayal and breaking of trust, each one of us need to take a breath, because you don't live long in this world before you get betrayed. Trust gets broken, you suffer one way or the other. This is hard. This is hard. And especially for Jesus at this point. It's so hard to see one of these 12 that he had chosen betray him. When he speaks those words in verse 21 in the text there, if you look at it with me, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testifying, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. Now that statement of Jesus, it came as a bolt from the blue. It was a stunning blow to the disciples. We read in the subsequent verse, the disciples looked at one another in confusion. What? You know, when you hear really shocking news sometimes, it takes your mind a bit of time to compute it, to work through it, to understand. Did Jesus really say that? One of us 12? Then I start looking around. Who? And I want you to note at this point, nobody automatically suspects Judas. Judas lived such a life of pretension and hypocrisy. None of the disciples automatically turned, it must be Judas. No, not at all. They did not suspect. In fact, they didn't suspect anybody. So these words that came, that Jesus spoke, was like a bolt from the blue. You know when there's blue skies and suddenly there's a lightning bolt? Have you experienced that? Well, I haven't. It's a bit of, no, it doesn't happen that way, does it? So it's amazing words that Jesus spoke. Now, Jesus knew, as we'll see in a few minutes, he knew it was going to happen, but he had kept the information to himself all these years. Can you imagine holding information, knowing who's going to betray you, but holding that information? And the commentators they talk about, why did he hold that information? Well, if he told people earlier, maybe they would have tried to stop Judas. And that couldn't be done because Jesus had to die. Judas had to do this because Jesus had to die. And if he told them before the time, you can imagine Peter. I'm sure if he knew before the time, I mean, a little bit later we see in the Garden of Gethsemane when they come for Jesus, Peter's the one that pulls out his sword and chops off a ear. What do you think he would have done if he found out that Judas was going to betray the Lord? He would not have sat still, I can guarantee you that. So Jesus kept this information to himself all this time. Now there's no longer need to keep quiet. The time has come. Jesus shares with them this now before it happens in the light of Psalm 41 verse 9, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but in the light of the psalm, in the light of this prophecy, Jesus shared with us the coming betrayal ahead of time, so that after the fact the disciples would know that Jesus knew about this and that he was in control. And they would continue to be his witnesses. And so Jesus, his foreknowledge of fulfilling the prophecy helps the faith of the disciples in the future, as we'll see in a few minutes. But I want you to notice as well that Judas kept up the appearances up to the last minute, up to the very last moment. Judas maintained his facade of betrayal and treachery and hypocrisy. Talk a little bit about the identity of this man, Judas Iscariot. We actually do not know too much about him. The name Judas is the Greek variant of the Hebrew name Judah. The word Iscariot, it's not clear exactly what that means. Most scholars accept that this refers to the town that Judas comes from, the town of Kerioth, which is Iscariot, the pronounced. So there are many theories about what Judas Iscariot, who he is and where he comes from, but there's no real clarity. The Bible does not tell us very clearly where he comes from. But that does not matter in this case, because wherever it comes from and whatever it means, very clearly the words Judas Iscariot. You can go to even unsaved pagan people and say, what is the word Judas Iscariot? Oh, betrayer. Everybody knows. This is what identifies him apart from other Judases. Because Judas was a very common and well-known used name in the time of Jesus. And everybody knows when you talk about Judas Iscariot, he was one of the 12 that betrayed Jesus. And that's what sets him apart, his identity. Now, in this passage in the book of John, I said just now that John draws a devastating picture of Jesus, and I want us to look at this picture. But briefly, in John speaks 10 times of Judas handing Jesus over in a negative connotation with the force of to betray. So whatever people may say about the words and the language, 10 times John speaks about Judas in a negative way, in the way of betraying and handing Jesus over to the authorities. Now, I'm not going to go to all of them. If you want the list, I have it here in front of me. John chapter 6, 64, verse 71. John chapter 12, verse 4. John chapter 13, our earlier passage that we dealt with last week, verse 2, verse 11, verse 21, and our passage this morning. John chapter 18, verse 2, verse 5, chapter 19, verse 11, chapter 21, verse 20. All those verses John is portraying a picture of Judas that betrays Jesus 10 times. Now, what does he say? Here are some of the things that, here's a character sketch that John draws of Jesus, of Judas. Judas as a devil. In John chapter 6, verse 70 and 71, as Jesus has preached, you remember he fed the 5,000, he walked on the water, he got attacked, disciples, he was doing some teaching, and many people started leaving him. And at the end of that chapter, in that last section, as the people leave, Jesus tells them that somebody from among them is a devil and will, like the devil, betray him. Somebody that is against Jesus. He's part of his opponent. Satan, the devil, is Jesus' main opponent in this world. And Judas is likened to the devil. The devil is described as the ruler of the realm below, whose main occupation is to lie and to kill. Chapter 8, verse 44, and chapter 12, verse 31. That's what he is like. Jesus compares him and speaks to him as a devil. And what does the devil do? He lies and kills. In the same way, Judas lies. In John chapter 12, verse 5 and 6, we read about that. And where Jesus is exposed. And Judas's lying results in the killing of Jesus. Go read chapter 18 and chapter 19, those two chapters, especially the first part of chapter 18, gives us a picture of Judas betraying Jesus. So first, John speaks about Judas as a devil. Secondly, he speaks of Judas as a thief. John chapter 12, verse 4 to 6. You remember the story when Martha was anointing Jesus' feet? What was Judas's reaction? Oh, this is bad. I mean, if we'd only had this money, we could have sold it and used it for the poor. He was a hypocrite and a liar. He was a thief, because that very passage tells us he carried the bag of Jesus, or the money bag, or the money box. He was the treasurer of the group. He controlled the money, and he took for himself from it. He was a thief. Disloyal and dishonest to the whole group. And he betrays Jesus and their trust. His hypocrisy is revealed in verse 5 of chapter 12. So he takes after Satan. Thirdly, Judas the apostate. Judas defects from Jesus to the opposition. The word apostate, young people, is a word that means you change sides, you desert your side. So can you imagine, young guys, you like soccer, right, don't you? Can you imagine if you're playing a game of soccer and suddenly in the middle of the game you switch sides? Huh? No, don't do that. That's bad. And that's what apostate. You apostate, you deceive and you change sides against your own side. And in a far worse way, we see here Judas defecting from Jesus to the opposition, the devil. He changed and set out to betray Jesus, to hand him over to the enemy in verse 18. And verse 18 is very significant, because Jesus here speaks about Psalm 41 and verse 9, and in Psalm 41 verse 9, King David is being betrayed. King David talks about a close friend, somebody that ate at my table, somebody that I trusted, somebody that I had table fellowship with. Now, in the Eastern culture of that day, and I suppose very much in our day as well, when people come to your house and they eat a meal with you, that's fellowship, that's closeness. That means you trust, and there's communion, there's a deep level of intimacy and relationship here. And when somebody like that, David, talks about this, and he says he was being betrayed by an intimate friend whom he trusted and had table fellowship with. And here we have Jesus and Judas in the same situation, and a similar scene. This is the hardest sin against us when somebody betrays you to this level. I know it is very difficult, and I know today we're touching on a very, very deep, profound hurt that all of us carry to some level and some degree. Maybe not the little ones right at the back, but we all carry this. Being betrayed, having your trust broken, or simply realizing that there never was trust. We were simply being used. And once people got out of us what they wanted, they turned their backs. See how lying, betrayal, defection, broken trust, all these things, hypocrisy, they belong together. How hard is it for friendships to survive, marriages to recover? Not impossible, but it's hard. In my many years of pastoral ministry, I've seen some marriages recover after betrayal. Most end up in divorce. About the depth, the hurt, us, how much more for Jesus? He who sinned and offended, he never sinned against God. He trusted Judas. He gave his all for Judas. Even in these last hours, there's an interesting little cultural issue that plays off here, and I never understood it until I read this week. Apparently, in banquets like this and in meals like this in the ancient first century days, the host, if he wanted to pay specific honor and attention and possession to somebody at a meal like this, he would break a piece of bread, put it in a sop, and give it to that person, showing special honor. This is exactly what Jesus did for Judas. He broke a piece of bread, or he had it in his hand when he was asked a question, and he said to John, so the disciple that he loved, to the one that I show this honor, he dips it and gives it to Judas. That moment, Judas knows for the first time he's been found out. He accepts this honor. Can you believe the audacity? Betrayal, the pretense of this man to accept this honor from the host of the meal. This expression of concern and love, even at this point, he has a chance to turn, but he doesn't. Jesus knows he won't, and he says to him, what you need to do, go do it quickly. The scripture tells us, it tells us very clearly, when he received the bread, he got up immediately and left. You know what? The other disciples still didn't get it. John knew by the stage. Perhaps he had signaled to Peter, but Jesus knew, Judas knew, John knew, and Peter perhaps. Judas gets up once he's taken this morsel of bread, accepts the intended honor that Jesus extends to him, implying his last opportunity. Satan enters him, and it's finally final. His doom set. Gets up, and he leaves into the darkness of his eternal night. Yes, it's nighttime, and he goes out to the darkness. And every commentator I consulted this week is agreed it's symbolic of as he goes out, he goes into darkness eternally. We'll never meet Jesus again until the day of judgment. And what an awful, awful meeting that will be. Terrible time. Grace and mercy of Jesus is clearly reflected and contrasted against the betrayal and deception of Satan through Judas. I want you to see that. It's important that we understand this, the contrast between grace and the mercy of Jesus and betrayal and deception of Satan through Jesus, through Judas. A lesson, awful lesson to learn. What a wonderful thing to know that Jesus never gives up on anybody until the end. You're sitting here and you've betrayed somebody. Folk, there's hope. You're still here. You're still here. You're hearing by God's grace, by God's providence. He has brought you to this place today to hear this. There is hope. There is hope. Another lesson to learn from this tragic defection of Judas. And it's very interesting, again, there's a contrast. And I think, Brother Brian, you'll enjoy this one. In the context of teaching and promoting discipleship, we see the ultimate betrayal. There's Jesus teaching them about serving and obeying. That's what discipleship is. And Brian loves to do that. You want to be discipled, talk to him. Talk to Brian. He'll do it. You won't do the second part yet. But you see the contrast? Jesus teaching about washing their feet in the context of this whole situation. Obedience and serving. Judas comes. And ultimate betrayal is displayed. The devil prompts Judas to defect and negate discipleship. Contrast, folk, is heartbreaking. No wonder Jesus said what he said in verse 21. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit. He was troubled. And as I've spoken before in chapter 8 and chapter 12 about that concept of Jesus being troubled, we're talking about a very deep, profound pain and hurt that he experienced at this point in time. Fourth thing that John speaks and that talks about Judas, we saw in the first place that Judas is a devil, Judas the thief, Judas the apostate, Judas the betrayer. John chapter 18, verse 1 to 12, if you go home and read it, describes Judas's act of betrayal. Clearly, it was premeditated. It was planned ahead. Judas used information that he had gained through his intimate relationship with Jesus in traveling regularly. He used that information to get him. He knew where Jesus was going to go. And he brings with him Roman soldiers and temple police and officials of the temple. They had tried to arrest Jesus before and they couldn't. And now they bring up the Roman soldiers and a crowd of people come. He uses intimate knowledge. He brings a crowd, an armed force with him. And he picks the side of the Jews, Jesus' most direct and immediate enemies, being used by Satan. He's a betrayer. Interesting though, let me just say this much. It's not because Judas knew where Jesus was or brought a big army or joined the other side that they arrested Jesus. Because we read in John chapter 18, verse 1 to 12, when Jesus said to him, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." He says, "It's me," and they fall over. It wasn't their power or his knowledge that got Jesus arrested. It was because Jesus allowed them. He allowed them to arrest him. He was in control. Just as Judas, a thief, a devil, an apostate, a betrayer, I want you to see Judas's remorse. Matthew, forgive me for going outside John for a moment, but when you turn to Matthew chapter 27, verse 1 to 5, there's that tragic story. Jesus, when Jesus was found guilty and sent out to be crucified, Judas realizes what he has done. Goes to the priesthood, the Sanhedrin, the leadership, and he says, "I've done wrong," and they don't want to hear about it. He takes some money, he throws it in the temple. His remorse is devastating. Let me be very clear at this point. You need to understand this. You need to plead with you. Hear this, young people especially. Hear this. Listen to me. If you listen to nothing else, Satan or the devil has only one goal in mind for you. There's only one thing he wants to do. He wants to destroy you. That's it. And we see it. We see it. Look what he does to Judas. His primary weapon and accomplice in this terrible injustice. Satan uses Judas to betray Jesus. Somebody who's not guilty in any way. And Judas, the moment he realizes, the moment that the die is cast, the moment it's done, Satan deserts Judas. Leaves him to himself. Once the devil gets his way and he's destroyed you, Jesus condemned and led away to be killed, now Satan allows Jesus to see what he has really done, the evil and the bad. And Satan does not now come along Judas to comfort him and say, "Don't worry, man, we did a good thing, you did the right." No, he doesn't. He doesn't come alongside to reassure him that he has done the right thing. No. Abandons Judas to his own depraved betrayal and wickedness. Consequences disastrous. What do we learn from this picture of Judas and his interaction with Jesus? We see all these troubles that Jesus went through. Let's remember to see the amazing love of Christ for us. How little we have to complain about in the light of Christ working out our salvation and dying for us. I don't want to minimize your pain. Believe me, I understand betrayal. I understand the depth and the hurt. Jesus went through this for you and for me. That's why he did it. Learn also from this story the power and evilness of Satan. He put it in Judas's heart to betray Jesus. First he comes, knocks on the doors. Satan doesn't come to you right away if you're a married person or you're dating someone or you're employed, or it doesn't come to you and say, listen, I've got a way, let's steal 10 million from your boss. It doesn't come that way. No, it starts subtly. First he gets a foothold, slowly knocks on the door. Whatever. See what he did to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. Comes to Eve and he says, did God really say that? What do you think he really meant? He didn't come up to Eve and say, it's nonsense, man, eat of the fruit. No. First he caused doubt. He sowed the seed of doubt. And that's what Satan will do. So here's the lesson. Satan is evil. He will come slowly into your life. He'll lead you deeper into sin. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 11 tells us we must not be ignorant of the evil that is about. Satan goes backwards and forwards looking who to destroy. I don't know whether we've got this book in the back on the library, but C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters. It's about a senior devil teaching a younger devil how to lead people into sin. And when you read that, it's eye-opening, it's mind-boggling. The strategy Satan uses to slowly but surely lead us into sin. How do we protect ourselves? When temptation comes, resist it, flee from it. And that picture flashes up on your computer, inviting you to an illicit website. Kill the computer immediately. Put it off. Walk away. Put it off. The last 6 or 7 months here in Plumstead, Deep River, I've had to sit with a number of people and talk about porn. Some of them in this church. When it comes up, people don't play with that stuff. Put it off. Delete it. Go tell somebody, help me. Don't play with the stuff. Whatever the sin may be. If a boy or a girl comes to you and entices you to do that which is wrong, come to the shop with me. I know how we can, nobody will catch us. Run for your spiritual life, young people. That's the only way you can protect your heart, to get away from it. Don't allow Satan to use you like a pawn, to be used and disposed of without a thought to your spiritual welfare. Oh, people, older people as well. Sadly, tragically, how often do we not read in newspapers of grandfathers or old uncles abusing their young nieces or children or granddaughters? What a terrible thing. So it's not just young people, older people as well. As you approach retirement, you haven't got enough. The temptation to commit fraud and steal from your employer. We read about this in papers, we hear about it in the news. People resist, run. Talk to somebody. Get away from it. Satan will destroy you. That's all he wants to do. More points quickly. Wrap up. This is important. Let us learn to watch jealously over our hearts. Be aware of not giving way to the beginning of sin. Psalm 119 verse 17. Be careful. Examine yourself. And I think one of the things, and I agree with William Hendrickson on his commentary on this passage, when Jesus first said to them, one of you will betray me, he didn't immediately tell them. And I think William Hendrickson makes a very good point. There's a place for self-examination. The disciples were looking at each other and saying, was it me? Is it me? Is it you? Who is it, Lord? There's a place for self-examination. Jesus gives the disciples an opportunity here to look into their own hearts. The very best of us should take time to examine our hearts, to guard our hearts. And when we examine our hearts, let them be filled with grave misgivings and wholesome distrust of ourselves. And fly to God, plead with God to help us. Because when we do self-examination, we know we're not able to overcome. We need His help. And when we think we can, when we think we're strong, pride comes before the fall. A tragic fall it would be. The men I've known over the years, counseled, as they've been grief-stricken, flirting with this girl or that girl, and then it ends up in divorce. Betrayal in so many ways. Perhaps this morning, as I've spoken, as I've been talking, you have remembered your hurt and your betrayal, whatever it may be. Don't hold on to it. Being betrayed, folk, don't hang on to it. Yes, what was done to you is wrong. Whether you've been raped, whether you've been stolen blind by your business partner, whatever the betrayal may be, wherever you find yourself, I want to urge you, don't hold on to it. To the Lord, you need to let it go, and only He can help you to let it go. By prayer, in faith, come to the throne of grace and ask Him. Ask Him who suffered the ultimate betrayal. Ask Him to help you. Come your betrayal. When you hold on to your betrayal, bitterness and anger will grow in your heart. I don't want to belittle your betrayal or your hurt or your deception that you experienced. I don't want to belittle it at all, but the fact that you are here today, Jesus died. You're here. You have an opportunity to overcome.